Stuart Hall's essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora, first published in 1990 in the volume Identity, Community, Culture, Difference, ed. Jonathan Rutherford, remains one of the most influential texts in post-colonial cultural studies. As a Jamaican-born British intellectual and one of the founding figures of cultural studies, Hall interrogates the nature of cultural identity, particularly in relation to the Black diaspora, post-colonial experiences, and the politics of representation. Rather than seeing identity as a fixed, stable essence rooted in the past, Hall proposes a fluid, fragmented, and constructed understanding of identity, one constantly being remade through history, culture, and difference. His work challenges essentialist notions of identity and emphasizes the hybridity, displacement, and political significance of diasporic identities. Context and background. Hall's essay was written during a time of increasing academic interest in postcolonial theory, diaspora studies, and cultural hybridity. It responds to ongoing debates about the nature of Black identity in Britain and the Caribbean, the legacy of colonialism, and the role of cultural production, especially cinema, music, and art, in shaping identity. Importantly, Hall draws from and contributes to post-structuralist thought, influenced by Foucault, Derrida, and Lacan, but he remains grounded in Marxist, anti-colonial, and Black liberation politics. His work bridges theory and activism, insisting that cultural identity is not just a philosophical issue but a political terrain where power, history, and representation are contested. 1. Two ways of thinking about cultural identity. Hall begins by outlining two conceptualizations of cultural identity, particularly as it relates to Caribbean and Black diasporic communities. A. Cultural identity as a shared essence, essentialist view. The first view sees cultural identity as a collective, shared history and essence, a common experience that unites people with similar cultural backgrounds. According to this perspective, Black people, especially those from the Caribbean, can rediscover their true identity by reconnecting with a pre-colonial African past. This approach emphasizes continuity, stability, and origin, and has been central to anti-colonial movements, Pan-Africanism, and early post-colonial cultural production. For example, many Black artists and thinkers have sought to reclaim an African cultural heritage suppressed by slavery and colonialism. Hall acknowledges the importance of this view in enabling resistance and solidarity. It has served as a rallying point for marginalized communities, affirming dignity and identity in the face of racism and cultural erasure. B. Cultural identity as a process of becoming, constructivist view. However, Hall introduces a second, more critical view. Cultural identity is not something fixed or innate, but rather a matter of becoming, as well as being. This view sees identity as historically constructed, politically contested, and always in a state of transformation. Rather than a single origin, identity is shaped by ongoing experiences of displacement, hybridity, and difference. For diasporic subjects, identity is forged not by return to a mythical past but through negotiation with present cultural contexts. In this sense, identity is not about essence but about position, where one speaks from, historically and culturally. It is not about going back to an authentic origin but about how differences and discontinuities shape our sense of self. Cultural identity is a matter of becoming, as well as of being. It belongs to the future as much as to the past. 2. Diaspora and hybridity. Hall uses the Caribbean experience as a key example of diasporic identity. Caribbean cultures, he argues, are inherently hybrid, shaped by multiple histories, African, European, indigenous, and Asian, as well as by slavery, colonization, migration, and resistance. This hybridity challenges notions of cultural purity or authenticity. For Hall, diasporic identity is marked by fragmentation, contradiction, and mixing. It is cut through with difference and discontinuity, and this complexity must be acknowledged rather than simplified. He draws on the metaphor of the rupture, a term that captures the traumatic dislocation of slavery and the Middle Passage. Diasporic identities are born out of rupture, not rootedness. This rupture breaks the connection between past and present and creates a space where identity must be reconstructed, imagined, and negotiated. 3. The politics of representation. A central concern in Hall's essay is how cultural identities are represented, in film, art, music, and popular culture, and how those representations shape self-understanding and political struggle. He argues that representation is not neutral, it is always embedded in relations of power. Dominant media and cultural institutions often present stereotypical or homogenized images of Black people. In response, counter-representations, especially from within Black communities, have worked to challenge, rewrite, and reimagine identity. Hall identifies cinema and visual culture as especially important arenas where these battles over identity are fought. He refers to the work of Black British filmmakers and artists who create new narratives that reflect the complexities and contradictions of diasporic life. Rather than presenting a single, true, image of Black identity, these cultural forms foreground multiplicity, ambivalence, and hybridity. Hall champions these practices as politically necessary acts of transgression and self-definition. 4. Identity, difference, and the self. Hall complicates the idea that identity is about sameness. Instead, he proposes that difference is constitutive of identity. That is, identity emerges through difference, not in spite of it. He draws on psychoanalytic and post-structuralist ideas to argue that the self is split, always partially alienated, always constructed through language, representation, and desire. This challenges Enlightenment notions of the autonomous, coherent subject. Diasporic subjects, especially, are defined by difference. Difference from the dominant culture, from each other, and even from themselves across time. Rather than a weakness, Hall sees this as a site of potential. A way to resist fixed identities and create new, hybrid, dynamic selves. 5. Cultural identity as a site of struggle. Finally, Hall emphasizes that cultural identity is a political battlefield. How we define ourselves, and how others define us, has real implications for power, recognition, and justice. The process of defining identity is always contested. In the case of Black and diasporic communities, this involves resisting colonial definitions of Blackness, confronting internal divisions, and asserting self-representations that reflect the lived realities of the people involved. Hall argues that identity must be understood as both historical and positional. It is shaped by history but also by how we are positioned in the present, by class, race, gender, geography, and power. Thus, identity is not only about where we come from, but about how we imagine where we are going. Themes and analysis. 1. Identity as constructed, not essential. Hall's most important theoretical move is to reject essentialist definitions of cultural identity. Instead of assuming that identity is something innate or biologically determined, Hall presents it as discursively produced, constructed through language, culture, and social practice. This insight challenges nationalist, racialist, and traditionalist discourses that seek to fix identity in the past. For Hall, identity is not fixed but flexible, capable of responding to new contexts and forming new solidarities. This view is deeply influenced by post-structuralist theory, particularly the idea that subjects are not the originators of meaning but are produced by systems of representation. Identity becomes a site of negotiation, conflict, and transformation. 2. The power and limits of representation. Representation is central to Hall's essay. He insists that how identities are represented, and who has the power to represent, shapes social realities. Dominant ideologies often present certain identities as static, pathological, or inferior. By reclaiming representation, through film, literature, and art, marginalized groups can reconfigure how they are seen and understood, both by others and by themselves. However, Hall warns against simply replacing negative images with positive ones. The goal is not to create a new essentialism but to complicate representation, to reflect the richness and contradiction of real lives. He applauds the emergence of cultural works that defy singular narratives, that depict blackness not as a fixed identity but as a space of ongoing reinvention and creative expression. 3. Diaspora as rupture and continuity. For Hall, the diaspora experience is one of both rupture and reconstruction. The Middle Passage and colonialism disrupted ancestral connections, yet diasporic peoples have formed new identities in the aftermath. This duality, of loss and renewal, displacement and belonging, characterizes the diasporic condition. It is not about return to a mythical homeland but about making meaning in the present. Diasporic identity is formed in relation to the homeland, to the host culture, to others in the diaspora. Hall rejects a romanticized view of Africa or the Caribbean as pure origins. Instead, he affirms diaspora as a creative, generative condition, where new cultures and solidarities can emerge. 4. Identity and political struggle. While deeply theoretical, Hall's essay is also a call to political action. He recognizes that identity has material consequences: who gets heard, whose stories matter, who gets seen as human. He emphasizes the importance of strategic essentialism, the temporary use of fixed identity categories, like Black or Caribbean, for political solidarity. But he cautions that these identities should not be reified. They must remain open to change, critique, and redefinition. Ultimately, identity is not an end in itself but a means for political empowerment, for building coalitions, and for imagining more just futures. Relevance and legacy. Stuart Hall's Cultural Identity and Diaspora remains a foundational text in postcolonial studies, cultural studies, critical race theory, and diaspora studies. His insights into identity, hybridity, and representation have influenced countless scholars, artists, and activists. In an era of globalization, migration, and renewed struggles over nationalism and belonging, Hall's concept of identity as constructed, positional, and plural remains highly relevant. His work provides tools for understanding how identities are shaped by history and power, and how they can be reclaimed, reimagined, and mobilized for resistance. Conclusion. Stuart Hall's Cultural Identity and Diaspora is a landmark essay that reshapes our understanding of identity in the post-colonial world. Through a careful analysis of representation, history, and difference, Hall challenges essentialist notions of culture and offers a dynamic, political, and hopeful vision of diasporic identity. Rather than looking backward to a fixed origin, Hall invites us to see identity as a process of becoming, shaped by rupture, struggle, and the creative act of cultural reinvention. For Hall, identity is not what we are, but what we make of ourselves in dialogue with history, power, and community.